Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization. Today is June 29th, 2021, and the theme I'm going to continue to discuss is to address the instigation of the British Empire, which is pushing us toward war with Russia and China. And today I want to focus on why we should take the advice of former President and General Commander-in-Chief in World War II, Dwight Eisenhower, on how to deal with the British and their imperial ambitions. In 1956, the British led an invasion with France and Israel of Egypt on the Suez Crisis, which was based on the fact that General Nasser, the Egyptian president, nationalized the Suez Canal, taking it over for the benefit of Egyptians. And the British launched an attack, and they asked the United States to join them. This is in 1956. And at the time, there were many reasons why Eisenhower was not interested in this kind of fight. But he issued a threat to the British. Either you and your allies pull back, or the U.S. would dump British pound sterling bonds. In other words, in a sense, economic sanctions against the British Empire for their continued war policy. This worked. The British pulled back, the Suez Crisis was over, and Eisenhower had demonstrated again an American commitment against colonialism, which was taken up even more strongly by his successor, John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was moving against London networks in his own administration and shaping international policy when he was gunned down in Dealey Plaza in Dallas in November 1963. Among those who were involved in that was Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, the brother of Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. The Dulles brothers played a leading role in bringing British geopolitics to the center of U.S. intelligence and strategic policies. And Kennedy had fired Allen Dulles as CIA director after the Bay of Pigs crisis. But for some reason, Dulles was appointed the general secretary of the Warren Commission report, which covered up the actual intent of the British Empire to murder John Kennedy in November 1963. Now, since Kennedy's death, the British have pretty much played a role of leading the United States around by the nose to intervene militarily as the dumb giant on a British leash to protect the interests of the empire. From Vietnam to Afghanistan to the present-day wars in Southwest Asia, the U.S. has been fighting on behalf of imperial powers as opposed to the interests of former colonial people who wish to have their independence. Same thing with economic policy. We went from a regulated financial system into a post-industrial, deregulated system, which to some extent was modeled on the Big Bang of Thatcher, which was adopted by Reagan and his followers as part of a deregulation connected to free trade and globalization, which has put us in a collapsing global casino economy to this day. So on strategic matters and economic matters, it's London that's been calling the shots. Now, there are many people who are still skeptical of the role of the British Empire. Well, look at the situation we face today. We're being propelled toward war with Russia and/or China by pushing regime change against them, which means sanctions, which means military deployments, containment, which sooner or later will provoke a response which could lead to a war. Why are they being targeted? Because they're sovereign states. They're sovereign states which will not submit to the arbitrary world order with rules drafted to benefit the City of London and Wall Street and Silicon Valley. Now, again, for those still skeptical of the role of the British Empire, all you have to do is look at the G7 summit and the NATO summit. Biden went in with talking points provided him by British intelligence, whether directly or through people such as Blinken and Susan Rice, Victoria Nuland. These are people who are part of a global British deployment through think tanks, through corporate cartels, who are provoking or promoting, I should say, the United States to defend this globalist empire. The initiating role is carried out through think tanks such as the Atlantic Council, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and so on. And we've detailed some of this in the past, as well as through the loyal media, that is loyal to the City of London and to the corporate cartels. These networks were upset at the Putin-Biden summit, which in itself is not a formal transformational event, but opens the door for discussion, including on strategic differences. And so what was the immediate result of this? The HMS Defender was sent into the Black Sea to provoke an incident. Now, most of this, I covered yesterday the whole surrounding of this event and what occurred and the lies from the British initially, and then ultimately admitting that this was an attempt to provoke a response from Russia. Now, the day of this event, there was a paper published in the UK Defence Journal by a fellow of the Henry Jackson Society named Robert Clark. The Henry Jackson Society was the successor to PNAC, the Project for a New American Century, which was discredited for its role in using lies to provoke the war against Iraq, which was part of its unilateral international order. That is, the United States and our immediate allies have the right to enter and invade and crush any government which refuses to accept the rules from Whitehall and Washington. Now, that's what the Henry Jackson Society is. This paper by Robert Clark makes the point that NATO has not been doing enough to address, quote, Russian aggression, unquote. And he said that the British should act to incorporate the Black Sea region as a geostrategic priority. He said the UK must develop, quote, a more permanent and consistent leadership presence within the NATO framework, unquote. And he said the UK-led carrier strike group deployment, which was already underway before this paper was written. In other words, there already was a plan to test the Russian response when a British naval vessel entered Russian territorial waters. He said that this carrier strike group can fulfill, quote, the vision of a global Britain as the eminent European naval power, unquote. Now, if you know much about history, there's a lot of this which is reminiscent to the 1853 to 1856 Crimean War, which was about what? It was about which empire would dominate the Black Sea, and through the Black Sea, the entrance to the Mediterranean and the whole Eastern Mediterranean. Because at that time, it was clear the Ottoman Empire was in a permanent state of decline. The British were afraid the Russians would move into the vacuum. Maybe even the Germans would move into the vacuum. And so their intent was to contain the Russians within the Black Sea, so they couldn't use the Black Sea to get out into the Mediterranean, and at the same time to protect the Ottoman Empire. So the British and the French backed the Ottoman Empire, which is Turkey, against the Russians, and a war continued for 3 years as part of the Great Game, which included the battles over Afghanistan, the question of who would control Persia, and so on. This is where the cauldron of British geopolitics was born. Now, let's look at this then. Well, this push of global Britain to maintain or to return Britain to the eminent naval power in Europe, while this was underway, including the incident and the aftermath of this HMS Defender incident, Presidents Putin and Xi had a virtual summit where they reaffirmed their 20-year-old friendship agreement. And it establishes the idea of, quote, enduring friendship, unquote, conforming to the, quote, fundamental interest of the two countries as well as themes of peace and development. Now, if you read about this in the Western think tanks, they're saying, oh no, a military alliance between Russia and China to continue to do bad things to undermine the democracies. This is nonsense. The impetus for this was economic development. A month and a half ago, Putin and Xi had a joint communique on the development of nuclear plants in China on the border with Russia. The Russians and Chinese have been coordinating the idea of exporting nuclear plants to Africa to allow for electricity to get to areas from Africa that have never had electricity. This coincides with the idea of the Belt and Road Initiative as a potential driver for economic cooperation to reconstruct Southwest Asia, the Middle East, at a point when the U.S. Caesar sanctions are saying that no country is allowed to rebuild war-torn and destroyed Syria. So the Russian-China agreement, which is being portrayed as a military agreement and as a cause for the U.S. to figure out how to drive a wedge between Russia and China. Instead, it's based on cooperation on military as well as economic benefits for both countries, and in fact, for all people. So, while this is occurring, perhaps there was an act of divine justice. The entire top level of the British military leadership has been placed in quarantine after the Chief of Defense Staff's General Nick Carter tested positive for COVID-19. The entire staff, including the Defense Secretary, Defense Minister Ben Wallace, were in a meeting with Carter. Perhaps this meeting was the one where they planned the incident around the HMS Defender. And as a result, they're now under quarantine. Perhaps we should put the entire British military staff, British military intelligence, MI5, MI6, and the City of London into quarantine so the rest of the world can pursue the job of mutual benefit through cooperation and economic development. So that's my update for today. I'll see you again tomorrow.